Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hi, I'm Jess and I recently had a baby. I am 4 weeks postpartum. It's crazy. It feels like it was yesterday and also a lifetime ago. So time is weird. Nothing makes sense anymore. So in today's video, I'm actually going to be sharing details of my labor story and the birth of my daughter and how everything went down and why it went the way that it did. If you saw my labor video, you know things did not go to plan. In this video, I wanted to explain everything that happened because it was pretty crazy. It was definitely traumatic and I needed the last 4 weeks to heal before I told my story. I feel like I'm to a point now where I can tell it and it's not as raw and emotional as it was immediately postpartum. I may still get emotional, but it's just because it was a lot for all of us. I do think that sharing my story is helping with the healing process. I do think it's important to normalize traumatic birth stories because, you know, the positive ones are always the ones that you hear about the most, and people tend to not share the negatives of birth. So my hopes in sharing my story is that if you've gone through a similar experience, you don't feel as lonely. So yeah, I hope that you're able to find healing as well, and yeah, I just encourage you to talk about it because it does help. I also want to say thank you to those of you who have reached out and have validated my experience. You've given me a safe place to share, and I do appreciate it. Having people check in on me those first few days after giving birth made a huge difference for my mental health, and just knowing that, why am I getting emotional? Oh. It meant a lot. The support meant a lot to me, and I just want to say thank you. It's a good thing I wore waterproof makeup because I have a feeling this is how majority of this video is going to go. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. If you haven't seen my labor vlog, I will link it down in the description box below so you can kind of go through and get a gist of everything that happened. But I did not ever expect that I would need to have an induction, let alone have it end in a C-section. That was my main concern when we went to the hospital for monitoring. I talked to the OBs and I said, listen, with induction comes risk for intervention, and I know that there's a higher possibility of this ending in a C-section if we do an induction. I was reassured that the only reason it would end in a C-section is if something was wrong. And they were estimating Max to be 9.5 pounds. They kind of always had that fear that she was going to be too big to fit. I personally that was never a concern of mine. People birth 10-pound babies all the time. I'm a larger woman. I have wide hips. They've been called my baby bearing hips for years. I was never concerned that she was going to be too big for my body. So I was apprehensive to do the induction. They told me that I had too much amniotic fluid. Because I had too much, basically the baby was swimming and she wasn't able to drop down low enough to engage and apply pressure on my cervix to help me dilate and go into labor. December 5th, I went in for the scheduled induction, and the method that we chose that we thought was going to be the safest and give me the best possible outcome was starting off with an oral pill called misoprostol. And so what it does is it helps dilate and soften the cervix. So it was just the best method for where my body was currently at that stage. And the goal was that they wanted my uterus to accept the signal and essentially take over labor on its own. So if you saw in the vlog, this is where things started to get very intense. So it had been 12 plus hours of very strong contractions. I was 6 centimeters dilated. Basically at this point, I thought I got the epidural around 5 or 6 centimeters. When I watched back the labor footage, it seems like I got it around 7 or 8. So I'm proud of myself for making it that far. So I get the epidural, and it's a walking epidural. So the dose is very light. So basically, they want you to still feel all the pressure, but no pain. So I'd say that the epidural probably worked for an hour, and it gave me time to let my body rest and fully finish dilating. Come to find out, I have a very high threshold for pain medication, which, I mean, I always kind of knew, but it was just, things get crazy very shortly. So I was 10 centimeters and they wanted me to do some practice pushes. So I was on my hands and knees, I was on my side, I was on my back, I was trying all different types of positions. At this point, you see the OB come in and she's there with the midwife and they're having me push as hard as I can. And they're assessing everything and they kind of say, okay, the baby's still really high. She just needs time to come down. And so we're just gonna wait a little while. They break my water thinking that relieving my body of the excess amniotic fluid that I've had would allow her to fully drop and engage and come through. They give me probably another hour or two, a couple hours to rest. And then my epidural started wearing off. I asked them to re-up the dosage and they did, and I don't know what happened, but the epidural basically stopped working. And this is where things got very, very, very painful. So the thing is, it's more painful mentally than physically. I mean, obviously it was very physically painful. Mentally and emotionally, I think it was so much worse. At this point, they keep having me trying to push, and I'm not making any progress. And so, midwives, nurses, OBs kind of start rushing in and trying to figure out, you know, what's going on. Basically, she was just not in the correct position to come through my pelvis. They tried everything that they could do to get her to come out. The first thing they did was the head OB reached his arm all the way up and manually tried to move her head to get it to come down. That failed. The next step was trying a vacuum extraction, and so they essentially put what looked like a plunger all the way up inside and attached it to her head. And while the vacuum was attached to her head, one of the midwives was standing over me, pushing as hard as she could on my stomach to try to move her down as they pulled from the other end. That was also unsuccessful. So after the doctors and midwives all kind of decided that nothing was working, she just wasn't in the correct position, they decided that a C-section was going to be the safest option, because I was kind of racing against the clock as well with having my water broken, and they just didn't think she was going to come on her own. So they wheeled me into the OR, and they started getting me prepped for surgery. And thankfully, Mike was able to scrub in and be there with me. After they kind of got me all set up, they gave me my first spinal block. This was supposed to completely numb me from the waist down so that I didn't feel anything during surgery. So they started doing like practice sensations, I guess, to see what I could feel and what I couldn't. And I felt everything that they were doing. And so when they would do like their pinch tests with the instruments and stuff, I felt that it was painful. It was not numbed. So they ended up giving me a second dose of a spinal block and still did not numb anything. I felt everything that they were doing to me. And at this point, I'm getting terrified because, one, it's being stalled even longer of getting her out because my body is not being numbed the way that it should. And I'm also terrified that they're going to cut me open and I'm literally going to feel every single thing that they do to me. And so after a couple minutes of hoping, I guess, that it would somehow sink in, they decided they were going to put me under so that I didn't feel anything. The last thing I remember is just having the oxygen tube shoved up my nose and Mike being right next to me holding my hand and saying it's going to be okay. And then everything went black. What they didn't realize is that because my threshold for meds was so high, I started waking up in the surgery. Mike said that I started moaning and grunting and making noises, and my eyes started to open. But what I remember, it was kind of like a out-of-body experience. But if you've ever seen the movie Doctor Strange, you know, when they're shifting all of the buildings and everything is like turning and going into one another, it was like that. I was seeing that, but instead of buildings, it was like tissue, muscles, cells, blood, just everything was medical. I wish that made sense. I know that it sounds crazy, but that's what I saw, and I was feeling things, and it was a lot. So at 11:55 in the morning, they pulled her out of me. Mike basically was rushed out with the baby, and they sewed me up, and I went to a recovery room for 3 hours, and then after I was awake and back to life, I guess, they finally wheeled me to our private family room, and I got to meet her for the first time. The most important thing is that we're both healthy and safe at the end of everything, and I would do it again for her if it meant that, you know, she made it here safe and sound. I think the emotional pain of how I expected everything to go and being disappointed that it didn't go that way, I think has been much harder to heal from. When you carry your baby for 10 months and, you know, you just envision what it's going to be like when you first get to meet them. And I didn't get to meet her for 3 hours after she was born. I didn't get that skin-to-skin contact that I wanted. You know, I didn't get all these first experiences that you expect to have when you first have your baby. But yeah, that is my story. Obviously, it's still very raw for me. It's still emotional to talk about. And if I'm being honest, I definitely felt like a failure. I felt like my body failed both of us. That was really difficult to accept. And I know that that's not true, but the first 4 or 5 days that I was in the hospital, that's how I felt. I felt that way because I didn't have any closure as to why it ended in a C-section. And it wasn't until I had my exam to get discharged that I asked. The OB said that she was just in the wrong position. She was trying to come through my pelvis forehead first. So essentially she was looking up like this. She was just never going to fit the way that she was positioned. There wasn't anything that I could have done differently. It would have ended in a C-section anyway, and it's nothing that I did wrong or that she did wrong. It was just the way that it worked out. I did ask some questions on Instagram if anyone wanted to know more details about my story. Main questions are, how well did your hypnobirthing techniques work? And they did not. I tried to remember everything and breathe through the contractions and be in a meditative state, and it just became too much. The other question was, how am I doing emotionally? Clearly, I'm still healing, but it is getting better. Like I said, the more I talk about it, the less control and power it has over me, and it's kind of like a weight is lifted off. One of the other main questions was, do you think there were any differences in the labor experience being in Germany? And I would say the main experience was the language barrier. Almost everyone that I was in contact with spoke English. There were only a few times we had to use Google Translate to understand each other. I will say when it started getting stressful was the point when all of the medical professionals started coming in and assessing the situation. They were all speaking to each other in German. And Obviously, that's their native language. That's how they communicate, and I don't fault them for that. But when you're in a foreign country during a pandemic and something's obviously wrong and you don't know what's going on, and they're speaking about you and your situation in a language that you can't understand, you can imagine that it would add some extra stress to the situation. So I'd say that was the main difference. And also the food. They fed us pretty well, but breakfast and dinner portions were terrible. We basically just got bread and some deli meat and a yogurt. So that's my labor and delivery story. Thank you for letting me share. Again, thank you to everyone who has reached out and shown me love and support. It really does mean a lot to me and our little family. More vlogs will be coming shortly with the baby. We've just kind of been soaking in this time, adjusting and learning and getting to know each other. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye guys.